assumptions, if you look at it scientifically, turns out to fall apart. They unravel as soon as you stop accepting them in a credulous, unquestioning way. And the one that I'd like to address now briefly is the idea that matter's unconscious. This was an assumption of Descartes because he split matter off from spirit, which was immaterial, and made the sharp split. The materialists get rid of the spirit and they're just left with unconscious matter. Now, as you'll immediately see, this causes a massive problem straight away, because if matter's unconscious, how come that we're conscious? If the whole universe is meant to be unconscious, there's an enormous problem explaining human consciousness, and in philosophy of mind this is called the hard problem, because there's no known explanation for it. Matter should not be conscious, according to this theory. Philosophers of mind over the last 60 or 70 years have tied themselves in knots, trying to explain away consciousness. One school of thought says, well, consciousness exists, but it's like a meaningless shadow of the activity of the brain. It doesn't do anything. You don't have free will. It doesn't actually do anything. It's just a kind of shadow, an epiphenomenon of what's happening in your brain. Another lot say it's just another way of talking about the activity of the nervous system. And as we learn enough neurophysiology, then we'll be able to get rid of what they call folk psychology, talking in terms of subjectivity and consciousness, and everything will just become a matter of describing the neurophysiology of the brain. The third school are called eliminative materialists, who say consciousness doesn't exist at all. It's an illusion. The problem is, of course, that if it's an illusion can only exist in consciousness. So it's a kind of self-contradictory position. And so these materialist philosophers attack each other because they each disagree with the other one's theories, because they're all self-contradictory or implausible, but go round and round in circles. And this is the centre of the problem in consciousness studies today. Until 20 years ago, scientists ignored consciousness. When I was studying science at Cambridge, it turned up for about 10 minutes in a physiology lecture, and that was it. The brain appears to be conscious. Philosophers argued about this for centuries. They've never got anywhere, so we'll leave them to waste their time on pointless arguments. We'll get on with explaining how the brain works. That was the attitude. And of course, we've understood a lot about how brains work, but it hasn't explained consciousness. A very interesting phenomenon is occurring right now. A few years ago, one of the top materialist philosophers of mind, Thomson, jumped ship and stopped being a materialist. He adopted a theory called Panpsychism instead. Panpsychism is the idea that there's pan means everywhere, psychism means psyche, as in mind or soul. That there's some kind of mind or soul throughout all nature. Even an electron has a kind of mind. And the idea there is that then consciousness can emerge in human brains because there are more primitive forms of consciousness in matter itself. Matter is not intrinsically unconscious or mindless. It has a kind of mind-like aspect. Interestingly, the top US philosopher of mind, Thomas, came out last year with a book adopting panpsychism. It caused shock and horror in the ranks of academic psychology and philosophy. He was viciously attacked by materialist philosophers of mind. His book is called Mind and Cosmos, subtitle, Why the Materialist Neo-Darwinian Conception of Nature is Almost Certainly False. And Nagel argues that it's incoherent to suggest that the mind can just emerge from unconscious matter. You have to have a panpsychist view. You have to have some kind of mind in nature already. He also thinks there has to be a kind of purpose in nature already, which is one of the biggest heresies in materialism, because evolution is supposed to be quite purposeless. And recently, Christoph Koch, K-O-C-H, who was Francis Crick's principal colleague in working on consciousness, came out 6 months ago in favour of panpsychism. That was a real surprise to me, because he was one of the most hardline materialists that I've ever encountered. He's now come out in favour of panpsychism, and it's now spreading through the materialists. There's a kind of panic in the materialist establishment as more and more people are defecting to panpsychism. Now, panpsychism isn't a new philosophy. It's the philosophy of nature that's often called animism, the St. Thomas Aquinas' interpretation of Aristotle. It's what the scientific revolution rejected. But it's coming back again, and it's coming back again in a very interesting, sophisticated new form. The most interesting panpsychist philosopher in the 20th century was Alfred North Whitehead, a British philosopher who taught at Harvard. And he was a mathematician as well as a philosopher. He was the first philosopher to realize the implications of quantum theory. Quantum theory says that photons and electrons and quantum particles are waves. They're not particles, just particles, not little bits of matter. People previously thought that atoms were made of little bits of matter like billiard balls. Quantum theory says no, the fundamental reality, physical reality, is wave-like. And that's the reason for the uncertainty principle in quantum theory. You can't pin down a wave to an exact place and time. Think about a wave on the sea. You can't have a wave unless it has time to wave in, or space to wave in. If you reduce it to an instant, it's not a wave. So matter's made of waves, and the waves take time to wave. So what Whitehead realized right at the very beginning of the quantum revolution was this means that time is built into matter. Previously people thought it was like little billiard balls that just persisted forever. Old-style materialism is based on a view of matter that sees it as just persisting substance. Quantum theory reveals matter as a process. And if it's a process in time, each electron, each process in time, has a past,